officially starting now.
So after the day is gone and all its sweets are gone, that Professor Marc Porée beautifully and, if I might say so, Mark, teasingly unpacked this time last year, we're delighted that Mark is back to introduce and moderate Dr. Jeremy Elprin's presentation. So welcome everybody, and over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Adrian. Thank you for inviting me, right, to moderate this loop seminar. I love the word loop, by the way. So it's good to be in the loop. Now, our speaker this morning is, I'm very pleased to introduce him, by the way. It gives me great pleasure to do so. Jeremy Elprin is senior lecturer at the Université de Caen Normandie. He was elected there back in 2015. He is the author of and received his PhD from Paris Diderot, Paris 7, Diderot. And the PhD was on a teasingly tantalizing subject. And the title read, if I remember well, because I was on the jury at the time, back in 2015, Challenging Unsettledness, Approaches to Reading the Letters of John Keats. This was a groundbreaking piece of work. For the first time, a scholar had decided to, to focalize and to focus on the letters, the manuscript letters of John Keats, and to draw conclusions from there. Jeremy Elprin is a romanticist, but his research also includes other, writers from the Romantic periods, such as Wordsworth, Coleridge, De Quincey, or Jane Austen. He has recently published an article on Keats for the Encyclopédie numérique digitale, the digital encyclopedia of British sociability in the long 18th century. The article is on Keats himself, and Jeremy is currently working on the figures of the common in Romantic poetry. Now over to you, Jeremy. We're looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, Adrian and Claire and the rest of the Loop community for inviting me, excuse me, to give this talk today. Now, one of the challenges of looking at, first looking into Chapman's Homer, and I think I'll probably just share my screen now. Can everyone see that? Yep, Adrian, Claire, you can, okay, good, thank you. So one of the challenges of looking at this poem in 2023 is that its hyper-canonical status would seem almost to preclude any sense of readerly discovery. And of course, I say almost because, as most of us have experienced, the feeling of rapt wonder which the poem articulates continues, despite its familiarity, to leave us spellbound, much like the silent conquistadors at the end of the poem. The means through which it does so have been explored at great length. One of the most beloved texts in the Keats canon, this sonnet is also one of the most critically overdetermined. When we read the poem today, we're at once looking into it and looking back on it through the lens of countless other first readings. What I propose to do today, then, is to approach the poem from a number of different angles as a complex textual object which is itself interested in the nature of poiesis and of perception, and which lends itself to many different ways of looking. Hence the allusion to Wallace Stevens's famous poem in my title. And in so doing, I hope to renew the sense of wonder which animates the poem, to shake off something of the film of familiarity which Shelley, echoing Coleridge, talks about in his defense of poetry, while suggesting a few ways in which Keats's sonnet continues to unsettle as it sets out in restless self-discovery. Before looking at the poem as a poem, though, there's a case to be made for seeing it as an epistolary gift. for this is how it was presented to its first reader, Keats's school friend, Charles Cowden Clarke, in October 1816. Clarke, the son of Keats's headmaster at Enfield, had also been the recipient of a verse epistle penned a few weeks earlier, in which Keats had paid homage to the mentor who had first taught me all the sweets of song, the grand, the sweet, the terse, the free, the fine, what swelled with pathos and what right divine, who read for me the sonnet swelling loudly up to its climax and then dying proudly. Keats gives voice here not only to a feeling of what he would call friendly debt, but also to the shared reading experience, which marked his most formative literary discoveries. It is Clarke who first taught, read to, and found for Keats those realms of gold alluded to in the opening line of On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Now, by 1816, Keats, who would turn 21 by the end of the month, had just passed his medical examinations at Guy's Hospital, while Clarke, several years his senior, had recently taken up residence in London. Having been lent a 1614 folio edition of George Chapman's translation of Homer, as Clarke would record in his off-cited account, the two friends renewed the pleasure of reading aloud together. A beautiful copy of the folio edition of Chapman's translation of Homer had been lent me, and to work we went, turning to some of the famousest passages as we had scrappily known them in Pope's version. Chapman supplied us with many an after-treat, but it was in the teeming wonderment of this, his first introduction, that when I came down to breakfast the next morning, I found upon my table a letter with no other enclosure than his famous sonnet. We had parted at dayspring, yet he contrived that I should receive the poem from a distance of maybe 2 miles by 10 o'clock. The poem was thus first packaged and received as a self-contained letter, one of many private offerings that would attest to the homosocial bonds at the core of Keats's existence. Crucially, even though the poem is voiced from the first person singular, it celebrates another shared reading experience. The multi-voice reading out loud of two friends treating themselves to the most thrilling passages of a 200-year-old translation of the Western canon's most revered poet. Clarke's phrase, teeming wonderment, neatly captures this sense of individually felt yet collaboratively experienced, or team discovery. And I would suggest that On First Looking into Chapman's Homer should also be seen, perhaps more fundamentally, as another kind of gift, one bound up in the spiritual gift economy Lewis Hyde writes about. That is, as a token of Keats's overbrimming gratitude to Clarke, to Chapman, to Homer, which assimilates and becomes part of a broader cycle of cultural transmission, with one poetic gift engendering another, overlaying but not effacing those which came before it. The sonnet can also, of course, be characterized as an occasional poem, which coincides with what is often referred to as Keats's Cockney phase. The poem was composed in the wake of Keats's introduction to Leigh Hunt, the reform-bent poet and newspaper editor to whose home in the Vale of Heath Clarke had recently brought his friends. This meeting, as Keats not so wildly surmised, would mark an era in his existence. And the young medical student found himself incorporated into Hunt's bustling coterie, whose activities ranged from improvisatory sonnet writing contests to botanical walks on the heath, to lively dinner parties with London literati and radical dissidents. In examining this socialized scene of writing, Geoffrey Cox has shown just how much of the group's work is occasional, how much of their verse arose against a particularized interpersonal background. And the sonnet we're looking at this morning is a salient example of these dynamics. It was thanks to Hunt that Keats's earliest experiments in verse would find their way into print. And of course, it was Hunt who had handpicked this sonnet as proof that a new generation of young poets were on the cusp of supplanting the established order. A neat prefiguration of those Olympian gods who would supersede the Titans in Keats's so-called late epic, Hyperion, written a mere 2 years later. As Hunt writes in his Examiner essay of December 1st, 1816, in terms which would effectively frame Keats's public career, for better or worse, he has not yet published anything except in a newspaper, but a set of manuscripts was handed us the other day and fairly surprised us with the truth of their ambition and ardent grappling with nature. The circulation of such manuscripts was a common coterie practice and reminds us of the distance Keats's poem had already traveled since its initial private offering to Clarke a few weeks earlier. This is perhaps an appropriate time to finally read the poem, at least the version Hunt printed, which differs slightly from the version of the 1817 poems. On first looking into Chapman's Homer, much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. But of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet could I never judge what men could mean, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Hunt's publication of the sonnets might be said both to reenact and to augment the sense of collaborative discovery with which I began. In revealing Keats to the world, that is, and in setting his work alongside that of two other up-and-coming poets, Percy Shelley and John Hamilton Reynolds, Hunt is actively expanding the circle of teeming wonderment. What's also worth noting here, I think, is not merely the dexterity with which Keats, as Hunt would later observe, announces himself as a new poet taking possession. And of course, the question of possession is one that we'll be coming back to. But the way in which the sonnet feeds on the coterie dynamics I've been talking about. The folio edition lent to Clarke, of course, had belonged to Thomas Alsager, Hunt's financial editor. So again, it was Hunt's gravitational pull which brought the volume into this old school social network and which sent it swimming finally into Keats's ken. As a testament to this social scene, the poem brings into play a series of superimposed voices, that of deep-browed Homer, whose words Keats had previously only heard, no doubt also with Clarke during their Enfield days, in Pope's translation, that of Chapman translating Homer into pure Elizabethan English, that of Clarke reading Chapman out loud with Keats, that of Keats himself boldly asserting his arrival on the poetic scene, and to some extent, that of Hunt in the poem's Cockney diction. I'm thinking especially of turns of phrase like goodly and could I never. But also, of course, in its evocation of exhilarated fellowship. All his men looked at each other with a wild surmise. Hunt's influence can also be seen in Keats's choice of poetic form. The Petrarchan sonnet, one of many forms he would apprentice himself to and in the process reinvent, even as his true ambitions lay elsewhere. Although some of his best-known sonnets are Shakespearean, one thinks immediately of Bright Star or When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. Keats's earliest sonnets are all Petrarchan. In fact, it was not even until the end of January 1818 that he would try his hand at the Shakespearean form. By then, he had written at least 41 Petrarchan sonnets, 18 of which are included in the 1817 volume, including his dedicatory sonnets to Hunt. The Petrarchan or Italian form was one to which Hunt, an ardent Italophile, was most partial, and which he had gone to great lengths to popularize. By early 1818, when Keats explicitly began to dissociate himself from Hunt and his Cockney preferences, one of the ways in which he would assert his independence was by turning to the Shakespearean pattern. As Walter Jackson Bate, one of Keats's great 20th century biographers, observes, with the exception of the loose, heroic couplet, which Keats also abandoned after Endymion, no form was so closely associated with his previous poetry as the Petrarchan sonnet. And the associational drag, I like that expression by Bate, the associational drag of the Petrarchan form was even less pleasant than that of the couplet. But for a young poet on the make, the Italian sonnet in late 1816 was perfectly a posto. It's associational lift, launching Keats into ever-widening orbit. On first looking into Chapman's Homer, bears all the signs of Keats's aptitude for the form, as can be seen in what is generally taken to be his first draft of the poem, a manuscript whose folds suggest enclosure in a letter, and which is thus considered by Jack Stillinger to be almost surely the manuscript that Keats sent through the mail to Clark. This, by the way, might be seen as another way of looking at this multifaceted textual object. In this case, as a material object, a holograph manuscript which has been carefully preserved through time and which can now be looked into thanks to the fabulous Harvard Keats collection, which comprises hundreds of digital facsimiles. Now, this draft differs in a few ways from the version published by Hunt. But what matters here is that we can already see Keats assiduously putting his rhymes into place, working his way through the octave with connecting marginal brackets, and then continuing more sure-footedly into the sestet. The manuscript gives us a sense of the speed and confidence with which he set to work, crossing out only one word, low, which he replaced with deep in line 6. And I think we can even see in the visual identity of the manuscript page itself, the way his handwriting starts to dilate, to open up and breathe after the volta, as if after laboring over the enclosed rhymes of the first 2 quatrains, inverted quatrains that necessarily look back on themselves, the poet could finally unleash the series of alternate rhymes, skies, ken, eyes, men, surmise, Darien, which comfortably complete the remaining lines before giving way to that striking material expanse that we see at the bottom half of the page. A sight or scene of awesome silence which mirrors Cortez's precipitous peak at the Pacific Ocean. One of the ironies of the sublime vision with which this poem closes, and indeed of the epic subject whence it springs, is that it's all neatly bound up in a poetic form defined by its concision. Some readers thus find in Keats's sonnet a kind of formal dissonance or incongruity, as he celebrates in miniature the most expansive mode of poetic writing, which also happens to be the mode to which he most aspired, as so many of the 1817 poems make clear. Commenting on the sonnet's expansive geography, the late American poet and critic Stanley Plumley once observed that it is probably unfair in terms of apples and oranges to place states and kingdoms against the skies and the discovery of a whole new ocean. The sheer geography reduced in size and focused here is amazing, and in its way puts the size and scale of the sonnet to the test. At the same time, it's worth recalling that the poem is not trying to replicate Homer's epic achievements, but rather to encapsulate a feeling of epic discovery, which in its own way is highly personal and self-contained. Just the kind of feeling for which the sonnet, which by that time had been sufficiently dislodged from its connotations with love poetry, might seem a natural lyrical vector. And thus far, I've been emphasizing the social dimension of the poem's genesis and circulation. But it would be, I think, tendentious to read its impetus only or even primarily as social, especially when we look more closely at the type or types of discovery adumbrated in the poem itself. If the title of the poem allows for some ambiguity, as it abstains whether or not we grant it the definite article, you might have noticed that in Keats's draft, first draft, he adds on the first looking into Chapman's Homer. So whether or not we grant it this definite article, it abstains from telling us whose first looking this will be about. Still, the first line would seem clearly to associate this discovery with the first person singular, even as the pronoun I selflessly cedes its stress. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold. The inverted foot with which this iambic line begins is striking, not least because it seems to insist most on the immensity of the speaker's experience. In this case, the metaphorical experience of literary travel. The muchness of this experience of reading, which is further inflated in lines 2 and 3 with the repetition of many, is important because it sets up the magnitude of contrast on which the poem's central discovery will hinge. Even though I've been around the block, Keats seems to be saying, with a worldliness verging on the boastful for a neophyte poet, nothing could have prepared me for this. All those realms of gold and goodly states and kingdoms pale in comparison to the wide expanse ruled by the blind poet of Chios. And it was only in hearing, which in this case also means giving voice to, Chapman's translation of Homer. And I'll come back to this shift from the visual to the auditory in a moment. It's only in hearing this that the speaker truly grasped the difference, feeling like an astronomer discovering a new planet. And of course, this is generally taken to be an allusion to Herschel's recent discovery of Uranus, or like a Spanish conquistador descrying the Pacific Ocean for the first time. And this is something else that I'll come back to in a moment. So the primary experience of discovery in the poem would seem to be intimately personal. I appears 6 times, all in the first 9 lines, and is then homophonically embedded in the sestet's C rhymes, as well as in wild and silent. And the distance between the individual and the group is reinforced at the end of the poem with the image of stout Cortez looking ahead of his men, who can only look at each other. Only Cortez, whose wondering eyes in the poem's initial and unnecessarily bald formulation metamorphose into the more piercing eagle eyes of the printed text. Only Cortez gets to see and not wildly envision the much anticipated oceanic vastness. This private screening, as it were, which is inflected by a simultaneous concentration and dissemination of eyes, that is, of the personal pronoun I and of the seeing eyes, looks ahead to a lyric by Walt Whitman, which similarly articulates the gap between being told about something and witnessing it firsthand, and which also ends in astral silence. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Whitman's poem, which was written half a century later and on a different continent, looks back on Keats's sonnet in interesting ways. But while it similarly insists on the primacy of individual experience, his cosmic vision is essentially Emersonian and democratic. Every man and woman is an astronomer, and the stars allow us to discover our alikeness. And this brings us back to the question of the type of discovery evoked in Keats's sonnet. As the title makes clear, the poem is not about Homer, but about a translation, Chapman's Homer. The possessive form is suggestive here too, as it conjures up an act of mediation as well as a creative appropriation. As Keats already knew parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey through Pope, the subject of the poem is not simply his discovery of Homer, but his recognition of the role that Chapman's translation played in bringing a new Homer into being, which now becomes Keats's Chapman's Homer, inspiring the young poet to seek his own place in an English literary tradition that honors translation as a creative activity. As Alan Bewell observes, the poem points to the ways in which poets, like planets, move through time and space by virtue of their translated forms. By recasting Chapman's translation as a reading experience recounted in his own words, Keats revises how we see the past while suggesting new imaginative models for the future. And of course, much of Keats's subsequent poetry is driven by the idea of retelling old stories in modern ways, of translating myths, narratives, or authors into his experience of that myth, narrative, or author, and by so doing, to make it a point of departure for a new poem. In turning away from Pope's translation, Keats was also affirming his affiliation with those writers of merry old England who would figure so prominently in his so-called late poetry, such as his lines on the Mermaid Tavern or his ode beginning Bards of Passion and of Mirth, both written in 1818 and published in his 1820 volume. Amidst a resurgent Hellenism in the early decades of the 19th century, there was a strong penchant in the Hunt circle in particular for Elizabethan translations of the ancients. As Geoffrey Cox notes, both Hunt and Lamb were admirers of Chapman, and Godwin had defended the translation of Homer in a work published in 1815. In his account of translation, which, as Cox notes, reads almost like a defense for Keats's reading of Homer through Chapman, Godwin argues that while one should avoid contemporaneous translations, obsolete translations are precious to the man of taste, the man of feeling, and the philosopher. In the Old English Homer, for example, I have some pleasure, inasmuch as I find Homer himself there. But I have also an inestimable pleasure added to this, while I remark and feel in my inmost heart the venerable and illustrious garb in which he is thus brought before me. This further pleasure I have, which I could not find even in the original itself. The translation of Homer, published by George Chapman in the reign of Queen Elizabeth and King James, is one of the greatest treasures the English language has to boast. In looking into this treasure, an image of wealth which reminds us of the many evocations of gold in the poem, from those old world realms to the new world treasures waiting to be plundered. In looking into this treasure, Keats is not simply reading a translation, but through a chameleon poet's sleight of hand, imaginatively seeing and thus seizing it, possessing it, in a way analogous to that in which Milton, as Keats would write in the margins of his own treasured volume of Paradise Lost, imagines his way into Satan's mind. This is what Keats writes on the top right-hand corner of the page on the right of his edition of Paradise Lost. One of the most mysterious of semi-speculations, Keats writes, is, one would suppose, that of one mind's imagining into another. The lines from Book 1 of Paradise Lost, around which Keats's marginalia snakes itself, contain something like an obverse or polar image of that with which his sonnet closes, with Satan throwing round his baleful eyes as he discovers the wasteland of hell. At once, as far as angels ken, he views the dismal situation waste and wild. The fallen archangel's angelic vision here becomes a curse, for the sight it comprehends is hopelessly dismal. In harking back to Milton's Christian epic, Keats's use of the word ken, which comes from the Old English kennen, to tell, to make known, points to a crucial tension in the sonnet between different kinds of seeing. We might say, because it's so topical this weekend, between epiphanic seeing, through which looking into is translated into revelatory knowing. Epiphany, of course, comes from the Greek epiphaneia, revelation, manifestation, or laying bare. And the more run-of-the-mill, if no less enthusiastic seeing, with which the poem begins, a kind of seeing which is imaginative, but in a touristic way. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold. The first kind is associated with the sublimity of blind Homer, and implicitly of blind Milton, and with feeling like some watcher of the skies, or like stout Cortez. Keats's recourse to simile here is significant, as it insists on an equivalence refracted through subjective experience, an experience of one mind imagining into another. The second kind is associated with the band of conquistadors who, looking at each other, do not know, but can only surmise. This is where the difference between the first two versions of the poem, Keats's initial draft and the text published by Hunt, and the version included in the 1817 poems, becomes most striking. When the seventh line, which originally read, "Yet could I never judge what men could mean," gets reworked into, "Yet did I never breathe its pure serene," an additional sense or layer of knowing is revealed. As common surmise gives way to miraculous, which is to say, epiphanic inspiration or breathing in, an image which anticipates the audiovisual reading experience voiced in the following line, through which looking into becomes hearing speak. The revision also involves a subtle shift in acoustic weight, as the consonantal could judge, men could mean, slides into the more assonantal did breathe its pure serene. The second half of this line, in its revised state, is pure Keats, showcasing the intricate interplay of consonant and vowel sounds, which would become a hallmark of his late poetry. The result of such inspiration is a no less wondrous breathing out, which can be felt, heard, and seen after the volta. After the octave's loud swelling, to reprise the terms Keats uses in the epistle to Clark with which I began, comes the sestet's proud dying. And this is where Keats, through the voicing of Chapman's voicing of Homer, really finds his own voice. As the sestet, which prolongs the poem's long second sentence, shoots rocket-like into space before landing back down upon a peak in Darien, it signposts its own expiration in multiple ways. An expiration which, as Christian Lacassenière observes, becomes its own kind of jouissance. As the last line climactically inscribes a moment of being beyond language, a jouissance in which the subject of language, is thus dying, a dying in the full polysemy of the word. Silent, the sonnet's climax is not so much in the poem as in the real silence that follows it as the voice dies. The end towards which the sonnet moves is thus indeed a ravishment, the subject's ecstatic ravishment as he stares at an image, the mesmeric sea, at an object which exactly meets his desire. If silence is the inevitable resolution of such a meeting, it makes sense that it should be accompanied by a metrical deceleration in the last two lines. The whole sestet is characterized by excited starts and stops, with rapidly enjambed lines giving way to erratic pauses. But lines 13 and 14 each begin, echoing the first line of the poem, with an unlooked for ictus. Looked, silent, the final blow before the poetic voice expires. This, of course, is by no means the last word when it comes to the poem's conclusion. Beginning with Alfred Tennyson and continuing today, many readers have found fault with the sonnet's final lines, seeing in them not perfect silence, but rather a telling faux pas. For over a century now, an obligatory footnote has been affixed to the poem, reminding readers that it was Balboa, not Cortez, who was the first European to see the Pacific coast of the isthmus. Indeed, this has come to be seen as one of English literature's most notorious poetic blunders, and it's been the source of endless critical debate. Marjorie Levinson, in a famously iconoclastic reading of Keats's work in the 1980s, took this ostensible error to be the perfect token of the poet's, quote, contained badness. In Levinson's reading, Keats's true rhetorical force lay in his ability to represent his own alienation from his materia poetica, which is to say, from the tradition of high culture that seemed inaccessible to a young man of his education, class, and opportunities. For Levinson, what is most striking and revolutionary about Keats's, quote, vulgar style is the way in which the poet produces the virtues of his alienated access to the canon. The supposedly mistaken allusion to Cortez epitomizes the stuck or frozen state of the tradition from which the poet feels alienated. Yet, as Charles Rzepka points out in the most comprehensive study of Keats's reference to Cortez and of the critical tradition's recasting of this reference as an ignorant blunder, the treatment of Keats's allusion as a mistake may reflect a more revealing error of critical judgment. It's particularly striking, as Rzepka shows, that none of Keats's earliest readers, including his most hostile and condescending reviewers in the Tory press, seemed to notice or care about this slip. Nor was the poet advised to amend it by Hunt or any others in his circle, who surely would have recognized such a glaring historical lapse before either of its first two appearances in print. In fact, Rzepka argues, marshalling a host of contextual evidence, Keats was not confused at all, but meant exactly what he said. When we stop reading Cortez as a mistake, we see that the Darien tableau in which Keats has placed his belated conquistador brilliantly underscores the poignant theme announced in the very title of the sonnet of the belatedness of the poet's own sublime ambitions. In other words, Keats's reference to Cortez should be seen as a deliberate formal choice. Like Cortez, who saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time only after Balboa had, from a Western point of view, quote, discovered it, a fact Keats would have known from his reading of Robertson's History of America. The time of the poet's discovery of Homer is crucially dislocated, belated, or as Jacques Derrida might put it, channeling Hamlet, out of joint. And this state of dislocation in Rzepka's reading only enhances the sublimity of the experience. But speaking of time and being late, I know we got a late start this morning, and I'm going to try to wrap up this discussion by saying something quickly about the sonnet's status as an early poem. I think some of you will have noticed that I've referred several times in my talk to the so-called early and late Keats, terms which I continue to put in inverted commas, as I've never completely bought into the convenient, but to my mind, reductive and to some extent misleading division, which is nevertheless important for agrégation students who are being asked to consider the two volumes of poetry which bookend Keats's creative life, the 1817 poems and the 1820 Lamia volume. And I'd be happy to talk more about this afterwards if we have some time for discussion. But for now, I think it's interesting to read the sonnet as a kind of out-of-joint poem in its own right, a poem which self-consciously announces its belatedness and which is very much invested in this idea of sublime belatedness or belated sublimity, but which is also often read as the poem which marks the start of Keats's poetic career, or even, in a larger context, as the quintessential text of poetic initiation in the English literary canon. It's a poem which both clearly fits into and stands apart from the 1817 poems. It's also a poem which in various ways looks ahead to other poems Keats would write. As Bate observes, the poem represents as much a summing up as an anticipation. The anticipation is in an idiom and mastery of phrase that foreshadow the greater poetry of a year and a half later. The summing up is in the materials and preoccupations that have long been accumulating. Bate goes on to suggest that what is significant for the later writing is not so much the discovery in Chapman of economy and condensation of language, as the discovery through actual experience that he himself could attain it. Earlier, whatever condensation he had achieved was in isolated phrases or lines. Here, it is sustained throughout the whole of a 14-line poem. And I like this idea of sustained condensation. I think that for students who encounter Keats's poetry for the first time, but also for readers long acquainted with his work, this is very much a poem which stands out for its sustained concentration. But as I've been trying to suggest this morning, it's also a poem which refuses simply to settle down into one stable or fixed reading. An early, late poem, we might call it, which continues to surprise in wondrous ways, discovering new force in, to return to Wallace Stevens' poem, the beauty of inflections. The poem it most explicitly anticipates is the Shakespearean sonnet to Homer, which Keats wrote in April or May 1818, but which was not published for another 30 years. To Homer, standing aloof in giant ignorance, of thee I hear and of the Cyclades, as one who sits ashore and longs perchance to visit dolphin coral in deep seas, so wast thou blind. But then the veil was rent, for Jove uncurtained heaven to let thee live, and Neptune made for thee a spumy tent, and Pan made sing for thee his forest hive. Aye, on the shores of darkness there is light, and precipices show untrodden green. There is a budding morrow in midnight. There is a triple sight in blindness keen. Such seeing hadst thou, as it once befell to Dian, queen of earth and heaven and hell. Another poem of blindness and revelation, of belatedness and anticipation. This sonnet begins with hearing and ends with the suggestive image of triple sight, an image which brings to mind another line of Stevens's poem when he writes, "I was of three minds." If one of the most mysterious of semi-speculations is that of one mind's imagining into another, I wonder what Keats, or Keats's Chapman's Homer, would think of one mind's not looking into, but splitting into three. Thank you very much for listening.
That was great.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jeremy. The end caught me by surprise. Is it because you thought we were running out of time? Because you have, you still have plenty of time if you wanted to expand on the subject. But no, expansion is the proper word, I think, because what I found beautiful about your lecture, and by the way, if the poem in question is a poem on the program, Programme d'agrégation, your lecture is certainly the ultimate agrégation lecture. I think it has it all. I mean, it sums up in a nutshell all we need to know and all we need to say about the poem, really. I loved every aspect of it. I loved each of your 12 or 13 sections. I wish there had been a 14th section, right? Because as a poem, it calls for 14 ways rather than 13 ways. But I can see the point about not being even, right? Ending on an odd note, right? Not even. I loved every aspect of it, as I was saying. If I was to sum up, I think there are, you said 13 ways of looking at the sonnet, yes, but I think they all fall down into 2 or 3. There are ways of looking up at the poem, right? And this is what we want to bear in mind, right? Because as agrégation people, we certainly consider the poem to be, eminent in every aspect of the word. So looking up at the poem, looking up at Cortez, looking up at Keats. Keats looking up at himself, envisaging this expansive career stretching beyond or ahead of him. All that is, looking up to the poem. And then there's the other approach, which is looking down upon the poem, right? And of course, this would concern sections 10 and 11 of your own presentation, right? The faux pas, is it a faux pas? Is it a faux pas? All of that only matters when you look down upon the poem, right? That is to say, when you start being condescending. And of course, I deeply appreciated Marjorie Levenson's book when it came out, and I think it's one of the great books about Keats. But I couldn't see why at the time, and I still can't see why now. I still can't see why she would identify with such approaches as that of Byron, right? Who, in terms of class, could only look down upon Keats, right? Because of his alienation from the culture, from the high culture. So why on earth would you want to identify with Byron? Even, of course, if the case of Byron is a complex one, right? Because I'm pretty sure that Byron revised his own judgments, right? And later came to, to be more sympathetic to Keats, much more sympathetic in actual fact. But the whole idea of, laughing at this upstart, right, who you can't even, quote properly, and who can't read Greek. I mean, the bloody mistake is not reading Greek directly and depending so lamely on secondary readers, right, on secondary sources, derivation. I mean, neither Pope nor Chapman speak out Homer loud or bold, right? Neither of them. And this is, you know, this is what I suppose those bad readers of Keats would retain. That is to say, the fact that he gets it awfully wrong. He confuses Chapman's voice for that of Homer. But how can you do that? I don't care personally because I don't read Greek, right? So I sympathize very strongly with Keats. Okay, you got my meaning, I hope, right? Don't mistake me. But that's the basically condescending way, right, of approaching the sonnet. To which I could add something else, which is a relative or a slight confusion of pronouns. I mean, you made the points, and that was excellent, Jeremy, about the pronoun I or mine or whatever being quoted 9 times. Is that what you said? If I got you right, 9 times is I referred to. And I, of course, comes to, you know, to rhyme with I see with my little eye, right? That is to say, the visual and the personal seem to go hand in hand. That is a fact. But another fact, of course, is the intrusion. And this is something, of course, which Christian Le Cassanière spotted immediately in his own Lacanian reading of the sonnets, which you referred to.
Yes.
The intrusion of the he, right? And in the last 3 lines of the poem, suddenly the I has disappeared completely and is overshadowed, eclipsed by the towering, erect figure of this he, third person, i.e. non-person, right? If you refer to Jakobson, a third person is a non-person. So all of a sudden the I, which was so very much in the foreground, disappears or is phased out and replaced by this, again, you know, towering figure of he, something that comes out of the blue. You know, why on earth should I give way to he? And the he, of course, is Cortez, as you were saying, and the he is confronted to the vision of silent sublimity, as you were saying, you know, of course. But where does that leave the eye of the reader, right? That would be my haunting or taunting question. Where does that leave us? Does it leave us on a par with the men of Cortez? And as you were saying, Jeremy, this is one of the sticking sore points about the whole sonnet. What happens to those men? Are they deprived of the sight? Is it something that is forbidden for them? Is it taboo? Is it off what's the word? Is it off grounds, off limits? Is it something they will never gain access to? Right? That's the question. And the question is left pending, I think. And that, of course, participates in the general sense of awe and surprise and wonderment which we experience as readers of the sonnet at the end, right? Because we don't know where to stand, so to speak. Are we to stand with Cortez? That is to say, are we allowed a glimpse into the unknown, into the blankness, into the whiteness of silence? You seem to be suggesting that yes, as long as you get a fair copy of the manuscript, you are left with this vision of blankness, right? Behind or beneath or around the sonnet. That is all there is to see, folks. Nothing, right? Nada, nothing. Tabula rasa. Are we allowed to see into that? Or are we left with the men to discuss, surmise, conjecture, and we might say speculate as scholars, as readers, as critics? Is that our lot? Is it the lot that befalls us, right? That is to say, to look, but not to see, to whisper. And I found that, Jeremy, this is what I like best about your splendid presentation, is the extreme pains you took at the beginning of your talk to anchor, to contextualize the sonnet within the context of sharedness, sociability, team discovery, teamwork. Yes, I mean, the work of scholars, the work of critics is a teamwork as well, right? We all stand to gain by reading each other, right? But reading each other is one thing and reading ahead or beyond is another, right? And that's where I stand personally, right? I don't know where to stand or to sit. Anyway, if I was to put a question to you, a real question, right, apart from my rambling, is the question would bear on the weight to be given to this much which opens the sonnet. Much have I travelled. As you know, again, looking upon the sonnet means or has meant considering that this muchness of Keats is a too muchness. There's too much of much, right? And that constitutes one of the burdens of Keatsian critique or criticism. Keats is fine, but he's too much, right? He likes to saturate the meaning, right? And then again, the fine limit is between, or is whether there is too much there, or whether there is just enough of what you phrased or you termed, Jeremy, sustained condensation, quoting, if I remember well, Jackson Bates. Is it sustained condensation or concentration, or is it an excess? And as you and I know, Jeremy, excess, surfeit, is a Keatsian word by excellence. Is there too much condensation, or is it the right balance? I'll leave you with that question, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Mark. I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I think that you raised a number of brilliant questions, as you always do, and questions that get me rethinking about my own reading of the poem and of Keats in general. I mean, the question of too muchness, of course, brings us back to some of Keats's own readers at the time, Shelley, especially, who advised Keats not to publish his first blights, and who made explicit, later in the most famous sort of single letter exchange in English literary history, that the one letter that Keats wrote to Shelley, the one letter that Shelley wrote to Keats, he tells him that his treasures are, if I remember correctly, poured forth into great profusion. And so it really does point to that muchness, the surfeit, the excess that you're talking about. And it's interesting to think that Shelley is of course paired with Keats in the very essay which introduces this poem to the world, and to introduces what would become the defining characteristics of Keats's muchness to the world. So there's already a sort of a sense that within these two budding stars that Hunt is sending into orbit, there's already a sort of competing view of the type of expansion or muchness possible to poets. And Shelley, of course, is a poet of muchness in different ways, but certainly he's not generally associated with this kind of extreme or sustained concentration, the condensed language of treasures and goldliness that we see in the poem. I mean, what struck me upon rereading the poem for this talk was the sort of brashness, as I mentioned briefly, there's almost something bravado, and it's paradoxical, of course, in the poem, you know, to open with this claim of having read so much, of having experienced and traveled imaginatively through the experience of reading, of having seen all these realms of gold and so many goodly states and kingdoms, of having, you know, as I said, been around the block, round so many Western islands have I been. To open with this claim in a poem which is also a single word in the poem, or Keats's muchness. But I mean, you raised lots of really interesting questions, Mark, and I wonder if anyone else has thoughts on any of those questions, or other questions they'd like to bring up before we have to, you know, wrap this up.
May I, Mark?
Oh, sure, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much indeed to Jeremy for your brilliant imagining into the poem, or imagining us into the poem. I've just got one very, very specific question relating to the topic of Englishness, and Keats's famous line, "I think I shall be among the English poets after I die." And what struck me about, well, on rereading the poem, was how un-English it is. You pointed out the Cockney dimension with goodly. There's also the Homeric epithet, deep browed, which is a sort of nod to Homer's style, or as we have received it in English. So I just thought it was very, very interesting that there is, on sitting down to reread King Lear, but other than that, there's the two the two sonnets around Homer. There's also the Dante one, or perhaps more than one, and this one. So I don't know whether whether you find a tension there between the sort of European Keats and the English one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. I know it's a very good question, and actually, just looking back at this poem, there's also, of course, the fact that it's an Italian sonnet, and that, you know, it also has words that are clearly not from Old English. I mean, demesne is a word that actually sometimes is talked about in critical discussions of the poem, because it's not clear that the rhyme would have really pleased everyone. I mean, you know, there's some ambiguity about whether this should have been pronounced more like the French demesne, or like or in its sort of English version, demesne. And there's also, I think, a strange sort of a pun that you hear in the word demesne when it's pronounced in the English way, this derogatory sense, which, you know, doesn't seem to fit in neatly with the line itself, or the poem itself. So, I mean, I think it's a good question, and lots of Keats's poetry does draw on foreign sources, and his relationship to foreignness is a complex one. I mean, sort of further on in his poetic career, which is to say a year and a half later, he would begin to teach himself Italian, and he would read poetry in Italian, and he also attempted a couple of French translations of poets, of Ronsard. He attempted to translate sonnets by Ronsard. So, I mean, he was certainly interested in expanding his own linguistic horizons. And I think what's interesting here is that he clearly was not only interested in the process of sort of translational mediation. He was also interested in trying to get to the original of texts written in a foreign language. And even though he knew that was sort of beyond his reach, beyond his born, with Greek, it remains an ambition. It remains something that he could sort of strive towards, and that would further nourish his own poetry, which is often seen as intensely, sensuously, richly, quintessentially English, isn't it?
Yes. Thank you, Jeremy. If I can say just three quick things, right, before we might wind off. The first is concerns, and I'll be very brief on this. The first concerns another possibility, another way of looking at the sonnet is calling it a non-post-colonial sonnet, right? Because it's, I mean, for us, 21st century readers, looking back to and upon Cortez as a hero is something which makes us, shudder, to say the least, right? I don't want to make too much of this because this is probably unfair to Keats, right? But certainly, right, identifying with Cortez, the conquistador, against those who were ravished and conquered is something which might raise a few eyebrows, but that is possibly a minor point. Second point, the one about and you were very good on this, right, Jeremy? The one about the limits between an early style and a late style, and your synthesis, brilliant synthesis, calling it a pre-late style, I don't know, something like that. This reminded me very strongly of what Edward Said has to say about le style tardif, right? There's an excellent closing, almost testamental piece of writing by Edward Said on those great composers and painters and writers who achieved their very best in their late years, right? Picasso painting at his very best at the age of 82 or 83, etc., right? And identifying what Said calls a belated style, which is made up of different, very salient characteristics, which you can almost identify here, strangely enough, right? It's a paradox that you can actually see the belatedness within what is, as you were saying, Jeremy, the first start, right, of a neophyte poet. And third and last point is your dialectics, which again I found ever so penetrating, about inspiration and expiration. I'd never heard the matter put so succinctly and so concisely. I thought that was brilliant. Rather than go on and on about Lacanian jouissance, your own was very, very apt and very brief. It consisted in seeing the poem swell with inspiration and then possibly decrease with expiration. This reminded me very strongly, since, the Epiphany is on the order of the day. This reminded me very strongly of those opening lines of the play Twelfth Night by Shakespeare, the dying strain. To me, the last line of the sonnet, which I always found to be shorter, much shorter than the others, right? What with the air of drooping, tumescence, right? It's post-orgasmic. The vision was reached, right? The epiphany was accomplished, but then the final line lets us down slightly, right? And the line ends with a dying strain. But as you would say, probably, I don't wish to answer for you, Jeremy, but this identifies with the silence, right? This is merging into the silence and ending the poem not with a bang, but not with a whimper either, something in between, right? Which tunes in with the silence that is to reign hereafter. That's all I had to say. But
we always like to hear all you have to say, Mark, and I would like to hear you say to go on and on and on and not have to not even have to answer or have it or have to leave you in silence. But I mean, no, I think it's I mean, all of that just suggests to me that, you know, rather than 13 ways of looking at the poem, we could have gone for, you know, 59, as Jack Stillinger says, of all the different ways of reading the Eve of St. Agnes. And I think, again, it just points to one of the main reasons that Keats is on the Agrégation this year, and one of the reasons that we love reading and rereading his poetry. And it's this not just the richness of the language, but this sort of fundamental uncertainty or unsettledness and possibility of meaning that his poems open up. I mean, there's so many different ways of reading just the last line of the poem, as a few of which I pointed to, and now you've just pointed to several more, a non-post-colonial sonnet, and thinking about Le Style Tardif de Edward Said. So, I mean, the only thing I think I would add to that is that I would have liked to talk perhaps a little bit more about the metapoetical dimension of this sonnet as well, since so much of Keats's poetry is about the making of poetry, and we certainly see that here in relation to the lines I cited from his epistle to Clarke, in which he's thinking about how to create that effect, not just the atmospheric and acoustic effect, but that we might say almost existential effect of swelling and dying. And how he's trying to, you know, we can sort of see him thinking through that in the poem itself. On so many levels, he's working through ideas that he's both imbibing and reworking and trying to apply to his own nascent poetics. So this is also, I think, a poem about making poetry and creating an effect that works on all of these different levels, that it's not simply a dying off, and it's not simply, as you say, a sort of fireworks bang, but it's something else, and it can be read in even contradictory ways, I think, in the end.
Mm-hmm.
The poem seems to have come out all of a piece, though. That's another thing that strikes me, with hardly any revision at all. Seemed to come out. He went back home after the all-night Homer reading session and did it very fast.
Yes,
very impressive.
So it was a swell of huge intensity, in fact. And
yes, and that's of course, you know, part of the romantic dimension of the poem as well. But I think there's much to that. I mean, if you look at Keats's manuscripts, you do see that he often, you know, produces original poetry in bursts of inspiration. But I think there's also been, over the past few decades, you know, a critical sort of tempering of that idea of the solitary romantic genius inspired in one go and just sort of, you know, writing it all off and not coming back to it. And we see that other dimension in Keats's revisions as well. I mean, he certainly made significant revisions to many of his poems, either after having written them in manuscript or at the time of preparing them for publication. And of course, he was not the only one to revise his poems. His publishers as well, Taylor and Hesse, Woodhouse, their legal advisor, Keats's friends, they all, that whole circle played a role in creating the poetry of Keats that we read today. But I think it's a good point that, you know, this is a poem which we literally see in the manuscript was attempts to capture that moment of that feeling of sort of euphoric, ecstatic, or epiphanic discovery, and you know, I think it's worth looking at that manuscript, the holograph draft, because we don't have holograph drafts for all the poems, and so I you know, I've always been interested in looking at the the sort of material identity of Keats's texts as well, whether it be his letters or his poems.
My only conclusion to that, Jeremy, is that now we can only look at silence. Because I must say you've said it all. I mean, brilliant again. I was thrilled to bits to hear you discuss the poem so considerately and so romantically, I suppose. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. It was really lovely to give this paper, and you know, it always feels like a gift to be able to talk about Keats, to be able to talk to you and others about Keats, and to share in this, as you said, sort of collective, collaborative experience, this of scholarly teamwork and looking into and looking at again and again and again. And so, you know, if I have to conclude with something before silence, I would just sort of come back to that first point about this poem being a gift, I think, to all of us. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Adrian and Claire.
Thank you, and yes, the gift is much appreciated.
Well, seeing as the Epiphany is a time of gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, you found the gold in Keats's, on first looking into Chapman's Homer, the realms of gold. And so thank you, Jeremy, for such a wonderful presentation, and Mark for an equally wonderful chairing of our session, and Claire for helping us out technically, and everybody who attended our session. And we think that the recording will be available to those who would like to have it. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, and have a nice weekend.